Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Rose Preminger. As I'm sure some of you know, I'm a producer and editor here on the podcast, and usually I'm quite happy staying behind the scenes. But in honor of Pride Month, Amy has very graciously asked me to take center stage this week to talk to you all about the transgender community. Because, once again, in 2025, trans people like me are still in the cultural and political spotlight, with our rights, our safety, and even just the fact of our existence somehow still being constantly debated. So, we're going to get into it and hopefully answer all of your burning questions. In the first half of the episode, I'm going to share a personal essay that some of you might be familiar with. It's an updated version of a piece I originally shared way back in 2022 during season 2 of the podcast. And in that, I'm going to tell you all about my own coming out journey. And then stick around, because in the back half, I'm going to be answering questions, a whole bunch of listener-submitted questions about the transgender experience. All right, is everyone ready? Great, let's get into it. In my childhood, I felt most at home when I was crouching by the edge of a pond, holding a net in my hands to scoop up frogs or a stick to overturn old mossy logs and admire all the tiny microcosms underneath. The natural world, it seemed to me, was brimming with diversity, thriving on the interplay of unique creatures, each as marvelous as the next. And I recognized myself as an equal spirit in that intricate community of life. I knew I belonged. And still to this day, when I imagine myself most being myself, what I see is my early childhood, a slender, spectacled kid taking shelter under the leaves of sugar maples and silver pines, dappled by the summer rains of central New York. But the reality is that trips to the woods were an exception in my childhood. Instead, I was raised several hours south of those forests, deep in the hollow of the suburbs, and vastly more numerous than trips to the pond were trips to the shopping malls, and long traffic-clogged drives across Long Island highways through the homogeny of plastic-paneled, ranch-style houses that metastasized across my hometown sometime in the early 50s. In case you haven't caught on, I did not like where I grew up. Now, I will say that most of my family still lives in that area, and sometimes I can see its charm. They've got great bagels and a good school system and all. But suffice it to say, for a queer kid trying to understand themselves, the normativity of Long Island's culture could be suffocating. See, from a pretty young age, I started to stand out. I simply was not turning out to be the person that people expected me to be. And in this context, it's important to know that I was assigned male at birth. All that means is that when I was born, a doctor looked at my external anatomy and made a binary choice. And my parents agreed. For many years, that was that. I was a boy, male, and would grow up to be a man. Or at least that was supposed to be that. But even before grade school, I was off script for what the world around me seemed to say a boy should be. I didn't care about sports or cars or action figures. I wouldn't eat meat because the idea of animals being killed, chickens being turned into chicken nuggets, that made me cry. I wasn't matching the masculine mold that had been laid out for me. I was sensitive and soft and, being honest, about as socially graceful as a giraffe on stilts. As a result, from an early age, I started to hear words like weirdo and loser loosely floated in my direction. At best, I was praised for being unique, for marching to the beat of my own drum. And at the worst moments, I was told that there was something wrong with me, that I was a freak. And then as I got older, faggot became the common slur for me. The environment I grew up in, the culture of patriarchy and homophobia I moved through, made it clear in no uncertain terms at all that I did not belong. And for a long time I agreed. they were right. I didn't belong. There's a quote from the poet and playwright T.S. Eliot that I remember reading sometime in my youth where he writes, quote, "I must tell you that I should really like to think there's something wrong with me. Because if there isn't, then there's something wrong with the world itself. And that's much more frightening." By the time I reached high school, I had thoroughly internalized that mindset. There was something wrong with me. Something off. The sense of belonging I'd felt by the pond as a child was severed. And I knew that the man-made world, the quote-unquote real world, it had no place for whatever I was. In those years, I was riddled with depression and anxiety, oftentimes unable to go in public, missing school for weeks at a time, just terrified of being seen. I didn't want anyone to look at my failure. What a failure of a boy I was. How I was failing again and again and again to become a man like I was told I should, like I was told I needed to. Had I had the language for my identity that I have today, things might have been different. Had I had queer and trans role models or seen people like me as anything but a villain, a victim, or punchline in the media, then maybe things would have been different. As my teenage years and high school played out, however, I'd end up trying to end my life twice before starting college. When it was finally time for me to leave home, I took my finger and I traced a line across a map of the United States, deciding that that was where I would go, as far away as I possibly could. Someplace no one would know me, someplace I could disappear. I moved from Long Island, New York, to Portland, Oregon at 17 years old, with no intention of ever going back, wanting to be forgotten. I'm going to let you know now, so you aren't worried. Moving to Portland would turn out to be a fantastic decision for me. My life was going to get better. But before that could happen, I was going to need to reckon with my identity. I'd have to come out to myself and others, and that was not going to be an easy process. Rather, I resisted it for years, trying to be anything but transgender. In my late teens, I came out as bisexual. In my early 20s, I came out as just ambiguously queer, but I knew I hadn't put my finger on it yet. It was like I was trying to put Band-Aids on a wound that needed stitches. I had internalized so much transphobia that the possibility of me being transgender was completely intolerable, something to be bottled up at all costs. So, before moving further, I want to take a moment to discuss where some of that internalized transphobia was coming from. And the answer is actually pretty simple. Some of it came from my friends and family, sure, but the bulk of it, overwhelmingly, came from entertainment. Growing up in a heteronormative community, I never had the opportunity to meet an openly transgender person, and so my understanding of what trans lives looked like came entirely from the movies and TV I watched. And what the media showed me did not look good. For example, the very first representation that I saw of an AMAB, meaning assigned male at birth person, wearing feminine clothing, was in the Robin Williams classic Mrs. Doubtfire. In the movie, Williams plays a divorced father who attempts to sneak back into the lives of his children and former wife by dressing up as a woman and pretending to be their nanny. Hilarity ensues. Audiences laugh as Williams struggles to fit into a dress. We laugh when he jokes that he looks like a serial killer. Several gags revolve around Williams revealing his deep, masculine voice while dressed in women's wear. And finally, the film reaches its climax when the cross-dresser is outed, being called a he-she, after having been caught using a bathroom. It's funny, right? I want to be clear, I loved this movie as a child, and I think there's still a case to be made for its campy treatment of gender bending as being at least somewhat progressive for the 90s. But the fact of the matter is that for a young transgender child, This beloved family movie taught me that cross-dressers and other gender non-conforming people are tricksters. They're trying to lie to us and get away with something. And the very idea of me, an AMAB person, growing up and wearing a dress was not only laughable, it was blockbuster comedy. Let's fast forward a few years. In another instance, I'm invited to a childhood sleepover where my friends and I watch another comedy classic you might know, Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. This time, the movie kept its transgender character, who's stolen a police officer's identity in order to kidnap and kill people, a secret until the big finale when the film's hero comedically tears this trans woman's clothes off, exposing her genitals, and then proceeds to violently retch, struggling to hold back vomit at his discovery. Again, this was not a one-line joke in a minor studio release. This was the climactic plot point of a film that held top spot at the box office for weeks. A film which I still regularly hear referenced with fondness. And as a child at that sleepover, I watched this trans character treated with utter disgust and contempt, all while laughing along with my friends. So what did I learn? That transgender people were untrustworthy and their bodies repulsive. And again, it was funny. I could go on and on with more examples of transphobic media from my youth. Seriously, it was omnipresent. Friends, Silence of the Lambs, Crocodile Dundee, Ally McBeal, Sex and the City, South Park, Dude, Where's My Car, The 40-Year-Old Virgin. The list goes on and on and on. Anytime a transgender person was shown or referenced on a screen, they were a punchline or a monster, oftentimes both. And I watched it all, deeply internalizing these hateful stereotypes. And here I want to pause and offer a quick note about the importance of representing queer characters in media, especially in children's media. I want to make this as clear as possible. The push for representation is not about encouraging kids to be gay or trans. After all, I grew up constantly watching heterosexual cisgender characters kissing and dating, and that didn't make me straight. This is not about changing people. Representation is about making sure everyone watching, especially kids, can see characters who look and act like them on a screen. It's about making sure queer and questioning children can envision futures for themselves, making sure they know, like every other child, that they can find love in this world and are worthy of loving themselves. I wish I could say things have gotten much better since the 90s and early 2000s, but the reality is that our media representation of transgender people is still incredibly lacking. We're seldom seen, and when we are represented, it's often with dangerous inaccuracy. In a 10-year survey of 102 television episodes featuring transgender characters, GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, found that 54% of the episodes contained negative representations of trans people, while another 35% were marked as problematic. Only 12% of these episodes were found to represent transgender characters in a fair and accurate manner. Again, that's 12 episodes out of 102. And as a quick update here, the survey that I just referenced was conducted from 2002 to 2012. Those were core years for me, my teens and early 20s, when my sense of self, my gender, sexuality, my whole identity, I was actively trying to figure all these things out, while also watching lots of TV and movies. It was important to keep up on the latest trends and be in on the joke at school. Unfortunately, in preparing for this episode, I was unable to find any comparable data as to how our media looks in 2025. What I can say for sure is that a more recent 2024 GLAAD survey confirms that the number of transgender characters represented in our media is going down. That might surprise you. It actually surprised me. I so often see complaints that there are too many of us in TV and films. But the reality is that last year was, and I quote here, the second year in a row that has seen a dramatic decrease in transgender characters, down to just 24 from last year's 32. Those were the lowest numbers reported since 2017, when we saw trans representation starting to decline. At a time when we desperately need people to be able to see us, to gain insight through trans stories and find empathy for trans characters, these characters are vanishing from our screens. Sometimes literally, as in the case of the 2025 Disney release Win or Lose, where several scenes were cut or re-edited in order to remove a character's being transgender and represent them as cisgender instead. Let me tell you, as a lifelong Disney fan who knows all the words out of sing-along, this one really hurt. But back to that original survey. In their 10-year study, GLAAD also found that transgender characters, when they did appear, were cast in a victim role at least 40% of the time, and cast as killers or villains at least 21% of the time. So that means 61% of the time trans characters appeared on the screen, they were shown as the victims or villains of these storylines. And, unsurprisingly, the survey also found that 61% of the cataloged episodes included transphobic slurs and dialogue. Some of the negative representations included, quote, CSI, which not only featured a transgender serial killer who murdered their own mother, but scenes in which transgender murder victims were openly mocked by the show's lead characters while examining their bodies in crime scenes. The Cleveland Show, in which a man vomits on screen for a lengthy period of time after discovering that he slept with a transgender character. Nip Tuck, which featured a storyline about a transgender woman who regretted her transition, a transgender sex worker being beaten, and an entire season about a trans woman depicted as a baby-stealing sexual predator who sleeps with her own son. End quote. What this survey tells us is that transgender people have been, and regrettably still are, misrepresented in media. Our lives are co-opted and sensationalized in order to sell stories and earn higher ratings. But those ratings come at a real cost for real people. When stereotypes run rampant, when trans people are reduced to victims, villains, and jokes, these ideas become reinforced in viewers. And these viewers often have little other knowledge of what it means to be transgender. Worse still, these ideas become reinforced in the minds of trans youth, warping their self-perception and undercutting their self-esteem, just like they did for me. Finally, these stereotypes can be, and have been, wielded by politicians to further persecute and restrict the freedoms of the transgender citizens they're meant to represent. I'll talk more about transphobia in our politics later. But for now, suffice it to say that when we consider the aggressive heteronormativity of our culture, the active misrepresentation of transgender and other queer people in media, and the near constant barrage of hatred from elected officials, I really think it's something miraculous when any person manages to come out of the closet at all. It is so frighteningly easy for me to imagine a world in which I never made it that far. By the time I was in my early 20s, I knew that there could be nothing worse than being transgender. The culture I'd been steeped in, been breathing like oxygen, had completely convinced me that a trans person's life was a waking nightmare. They were destined to be reviled, abused, outcast, or worse. I knew a trans person's life would be one of two things: a comedy, because nothing is more worthy of derision and mockery than someone pretending to be a different sex, or a tragedy, because nothing is more revolting and untrustworthy, more deserving of violence than a trans person's body. I didn't want that to be me. That couldn't be me. I was terrified. I was so consumed with self-loathing, I couldn't even fathom the possibility that I would love myself one day. Instead in my early 20s, I was disgusted by the thoughts that would sometimes well up in me for the truths I was constantly trying to tell myself. It didn't even make sense. I knew I wasn't a woman, but more and more I was realizing that I wasn't a man. What did that make me? I didn't know the word non-binary back then. The words that patriarchy had taught me were fag, tranny, and worse. I shoved those thoughts, that possibility, those words as deep down as I could. I tried to hide from myself with statements like, I've just got to play the hand I've been dealt, and, gender is really not that big a deal to me. I did everything I could to run away from the dawning discovery. I tried to drown the truth in alcohol. At this point in my life, drinking and fantasies of suicide had become near constant companions. In the mornings, I would wake up hungover, my memory hazy, and find letters I'd drunkenly written to myself the night before, begging myself to confront who I really am, to do anything at all. I'll quote from one of those letters now. Sam, this has to stop. It didn't always hurt this much. I know it hurts now. You need to be who you are. Remember the pond, the frogs and deep forest moss. Remember music. Remember the sounds of the summer rain. I promise you, you don't want to die. Try to remember the rain. Okay. So I've talked a lot already about the ways our culture propagates distrust, hatred, and disgust as appropriate responses to transgender people. That was a big part of my struggle. But another part of my struggle was about knowledge, about history. At this point in my life, I knew I wasn't a man or a woman, but I didn't know there were other possibilities. I was defining myself by what I wasn't and had no clear grasp on who I was. What else was I supposed to do when I'd never heard what the word non-binary even meant? That information had been kept from me. And it occurs to me that a few folks listening might not have been exposed to this knowledge either. So I'm going to share, real quick, some history of non-binary or NB people. Let's get a definition going first. Quoting from the National Center for Transgender Equality, quote, most people, including transgender people, are either men or women. But some people don't fit neatly into those categories. For example, some people have a gender that blends elements of being a man or a woman, while other people have a gender that's different from either male or female. Some people don't identify with any gender. Some people's gender changes over time. People whose gender is not male or female use many different terms to describe themselves, with non-binary being one of the most common. Other terms include genderqueer, agender, bigender, and more. None of these terms mean exactly the same thing, but all speak to an experience of gender that is not simply male or female. End quote. Non-binary identities are numerous, and non-binary experiences are each as varied and unique as the experiences of any other gender. There is so much space beyond the gender binary. Now that we know who we're talking about, though, the other important thing to know, and that I didn't know until fairly recently, is that non-binary people have always existed. We've been here as far back as gender's invention, and historical records of non-binary people can be found all across the globe. To quote transgender archaeologist Gabby Amoni-Hartman, I often find myself overwhelmed with deep feelings of nostalgia when I learn about ancient times. Human beings have lived with fluid notions of masculinity and femininity in various cultures throughout most of human history, without their existence being demonized and violated. End quote. Examples of these non-binary identities, which have existed all throughout history and into the present day, include the Hijra in India, Mujeres in Mexico, Mahu in Polynesia, and numerous two-spirit identities across North America. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds made up, because if non-binary and third gender identities have existed for so long and in so many places, why wouldn't I have heard of them before? And I think that's a great question that's deserving of an answer. Some of our lack of awareness can be chalked up to cisgender bias in academia. For instance, according to Dr. Pamela Geller, a scholar of bioarchaeology who specializes in the analysis of ancient human remains, quote, despite the fact that archaeologists regularly come upon evidence that some people did not fit sex and gender binaries, those researchers still have a tendency to diminish their relevance, relegating them to anomalies or ambiguous cases, end quote. And then, of course, there's also a reason that we've been made to feel as if this were all new, as if we were making it up. And that reason, were I to sum it up in one word, is this: patriarchy. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, isn't patriarchy about the oppression of women? Why would patriarchal structures care about trans people? Let's look at that for a moment. Patriarchy, at its very core, is built atop the belief in a gender binary. In fact, I would argue that the survival of patriarchy depends upon gender essentialism and binary gender to do the following. A, determine and enforce a division of labor, often one where the brunt of undervalued and exhausting work falls on the shoulders of women. B, regulate the behaviors, appearance, and value allotted to each gender. And C, claim that these social categories are natural and inviolable. To put it another way, patriarchy relies on the rigid division of all people into two categories in order to situate one category, men, above the other, women. This means that the very existence of transgender and other gender nonconforming people would challenge that power structure. And we're punished for it. Our political leaders, faith leaders, and others paint us as predators and enemies to women, encouraging oppressed populations to fight amongst ourselves. Our nation's laws target trans people, especially trans youth, with draconian restrictions on their rights to access things like life-saving health care, safe spaces, or even their access to the bathroom. Our media represents trans people as deceptive deviants, villains, victims, or as punchlines to hateful jokes. In short, the systems of patriarchy have historically and are in this very moment working to silence and, if possible, erase the existence of transgender people. Throughout our history, the gender binary has been treated as immutable, codified in law, enshrouded in religion, and aggressively enforced by a male-dominated culture. And yes, most often this binary is wielded as a bludgeon against women, restricting their freedoms and social roles in favor of men's dominance. But the transgender population is enduring constant collateral damage from these patriarchal norms. I'll say that again. Regardless of your personal beliefs on gender, the fact is that the gender binary has historically been, and is still today, used as a tool for enforcing patriarchal norms. It is used as a weapon against women, and its impact greatly injures trans people as well. With this in mind, it's no wonder that transgressions against this binary have been erased from our cultural memory. Knowledge of transgender people has been carefully concealed and eradicated by patriarchy for centuries. It's the reason that the Nazis burned over 20,000 books on sexuality and gender during World War II. It's the reason that British colonizers attempted to eradicate the gender nonconforming Hijra population in occupied India. And it's the reason that the Trump administration erased all mentions of trans people from the White House's website and cut off our access to receive properly gendered documentation like passports and birth certificates. Trans erasure, just like the erasures of women and people of color, is not accidental. It's a tactic used to protect patriarchal institutions. By creating a cultural narrative that transgender people have no past, the patriarchy makes the argument that we should have no future become a lot more palatable. They convince trans people that we should be grateful if we're permitted to exist at all in their world, and convince all of us that the gender binary is absolute, unchangeable, and neatly and naturally divides society into powerful men and the women they preside over. Fortunately, however, as increasing numbers of people come forward to challenge this binary, to share their stories and try to correct some of the damage our media and other institutions have wrought, that patriarchal narrative of two stringent genders is beginning to crumble. We have a long way to go. There is so much work ahead of us, but it's possible to see some light at the end of the tunnel, to imagine futures where these cruel systems are little more than embarrassing relics of our past. And I'm happy to say that, with the support of friends and family and partners, things did get better, at least for me. In my mid-20s, I came out of the closet and into my identity as a transgender person. And anyone who's known me will tell you that I'm happier today than I've ever been before. Since coming out, life has only gotten better. I'm finding peace with myself, acceptance of myself. I've been finally falling in love with myself. So many of the internal struggles I spent my younger years wrestling with have washed away, and I'm happy to be in the process of healing the injuries that went deeper. And yet, now living as an openly non-binary person, while many internal struggles have resolved, I am suddenly faced with all manner of external struggles. However high I hold my head up and eagerly I try to engage with our world, it's often not a kind place for transgender people. It takes practice and thought and care for transgender people to move through this world that patriarchy has created. To quote the non-binary activist and author Alok Vaid-Menon, "The days I feel most beautiful are the days I'm most afraid." As transgender people, we have to consider what streets we can walk down, what clothes it's safe to wear, what bathrooms we won't become a target in. And if we make a misstep, there can be very, very real consequences. Sometimes those consequences occur regardless. Every transgender person I know has been threatened with violence, and most have experienced it. Even in my progressive city, multiple transgender women have been murdered without consequence. Walking down the street, it's almost a guarantee that I will attract stares, if not harassment, from people I pass by. There's still the issue of trans misrepresentation anytime I turn on my TV. And if I dare look at politics, I'm buffeted by this barrage of hatred. To put it simply, there are far too many anti-queer and anti-transgender bills, either active or under consideration across the country. When I first wrote this essay in 2022, there were around 238 anti-LGBTQIA plus bills being considered around our country. That number seemed frightening at the time. But as I'm speaking now, in June of 2025, that number has grown to a staggering 920 bills targeting trans people explicitly, 112 of which have already passed. That escalation is jaw-dropping and utterly unparalleled. It is the highest incidence of anti-LGBTQIA plus legislation being introduced in American history to date, though the number has grown dramatically in each of the past 5 years. All of these bills target trans people directly. They include everything from demanding life imprisonment of doctors who prescribe gender-affirming care to forcibly outing transgender children in schools. In fact, the majority of these bills are clearly aimed at queer and questioning children, with over 39% of trans youth now living in states where gender-affirming care has been banned. While many of these bills I reference won't become laws, many of them will. And more than this, the very fact that we so actively debate transgender rights in the halls of our government carries a serious toll. Mental health experts draw a direct line between statements made by politicians and individual well-being. According to Dr. Adam Jowett, the chair of the British Psychological Society's Sexuality section, quote, "There is strong evidence that minorities experience greater levels of stress when their rights are being debated," end quote. We can see this in data too. With the Trevor Project, our nation's leading suicide prevention hotline for queer people, reporting a 700% increase in calls to their crisis lines on November 6, 2024, the day after Donald Trump's re-election. I can also attest to the effects of this stress myself. As many other marginalized people know, it is exhausting to watch after centuries of our ancestors struggling for liberation as small, homogenous panels of people, overwhelmingly straight, overwhelmingly cisgender, overwhelmingly men, debate whether or not my community should be allowed to have rights. Before wrapping up this section, there's one last story I'd like to share. I'm going to share a more recent story. This was back in March of last year. My partner and I had flown down to California to meet my sister and my amazing kid nephews for a few days in Disneyland. Remember how I mentioned earlier that I love Disney? I was so excited to get to spend time with my family in this place that's always lots of fun, and most of all, I was excited to be included in making some vacation memories with my nephews. And by and large, it was a fantastic trip. We ate giant pretzels and we rode the Millennium Falcon ride, my older nephew's favorite, like again and again and again. It was a blast. Until, during one of our last days visiting, I got maybe a little too comfortable and went to use the bathroom by myself. Now, some listeners might be wondering, what's the big deal? You went to the bathroom by yourself like most folks do everywhere, every day. Well, here's the big deal. A 2013 survey from UCLA's Williams Institute found that nearly 70% of trans people had experienced negative interactions in public facilities, from dirty looks to snide comments to physical violence. I know that this data is somewhat dated, and I apologize that more recent studies aren't available at this moment, but honestly, based on my own experience, I'd be shocked if that percentage hasn't gone up in the years since. Consistently, when using unfamiliar public restrooms, particularly outside of my small progressive bubble, I find myself subject to negative interactions. It happens about twice a year, more if I travel. Harassment and assault in public bathrooms are a constant risk for trans people. And this is the reason that transgender people like myself run into problems with things like dehydration and urinary tract issues. We're literally afraid to use the bathroom. Although, based on the popular narrative around trans people in bathrooms, you might think otherwise. To summarize simply, all those hateful stereotypes we discussed earlier, remember the ones where transgender people are presented as liars and villains, that all gets blended with politics here in some truly malicious and misogynistic ways. The popular story goes like this. Men are dressing up as women in order to gain access to women's restrooms and assault them. This is why, as of the moment I'm writing this, 2 states, Utah and Florida, have adopted bathroom laws making it a criminal offense for trans people to use the bathroom of their authentic gender. My mom lives in Florida, actually, and routinely asks why I don't come visit her. I really don't know what to tell her anymore. This sort of fear-mongering around restrooms is rhetoric we hear from political leaders relentlessly. That bathroom bills regulating who can use which facilities are necessary to protect women and children from sexual predators. Despite this, however, as of the date of this recording, there has still never been a single verified case of a trans person assaulting someone else in a public facility. I want to emphasize that. There's never been a single verifiable instance of a trans person attacking someone else in a public restroom. To be honest, I did not know that before doing the original research for this essay. I'm embarrassed to admit that I'd heard the myth of transgender predators so many times that I thought it must, to some extent, be true. But it isn't true. In fact, it's almost an identical twin to the fallacious arguments that were once used to advocate for things like racial segregation. It's that same old claim that white men need to defend their women from the dangerous outsider. It's an argument grounded on fear-mongering, on prejudice, and the treatment of women as a helpless social resource needing to be governed for their own protection. And alarmingly, it's an argument that still holds a great deal of power, making bathroom trips a constant nuisance for many transgender people. I'll break it down for you. Ordinarily, using a public restroom looks something like this for me. Step 1, I wait outside until I don't see anybody go in or out for several minutes. Step 2, I hurriedly step in, head down to avoid anyone seeing my face, and rush to a stall. Step 3, if anyone else is in the restroom already or enters, wait in the stall for them to leave. And step 4, only when I'm certain the room is empty, I scurry to the sink, scrub my hands as quickly as possible, and of course carry some disinfectant just in case I don't have time, and then get out of there immediately. No checking the mirror. After several years of being openly transgender, I have this routine down to an art. But on that sunny March afternoon in Disneyland, I was not at a local bodega or a friendly Portland cafe. I was in a crowded theme park filled with strangers. I was going to have to go in, and I was going to have to be seen. There'd be nowhere to hide. I didn't want to have to make the binary decision, men's room or women's room, but my body was giving me no choice. Now, some listeners might notice that the story I'm telling right now sounds alarmingly similar to the story I told back in 2022. And it is. Unfortunately, what comes next is a very common occurrence. Back in that moment, I first queued up for the women's room. My thinking being that, 1, it's a longer line and thus more respectful to wait in that. And 2, my outfit looked a lot more like the outfits in that line than the other line. As I stepped in and took my place among the women there, I started questioning myself, though. The woman in front of me shuffled around, placed herself between me and her daughter. But maybe she's just getting her kid ready to be fast once she gets in. Try to keep the line moving. I convinced myself it's not about me. If anything, she's just being considerate, but it's no use. The anxiety inside me is already starting to seep. Are people looking at me? Is it my hair? Maybe they just like my necklace, my hat. More women queue up behind me, and I can feel eyes scrutinizing me head to toe. A man exits the other restroom and walks past, pausing to glare at me in the women's line. He looks angry. His shirt has an American flag. I wonder if I'm in the wrong place. I would use the non-gendered accessible restroom, but I can see there's a queue of folks with mobility aids and toddlers waiting there already. Someone in the line clears their throat. I glance around, but no one's willing to meet my eye. My heart starts racing. I slipped out of that line with my head kept down, hurrying to a quiet corner for a moment to steady my breathing. I assure myself everything's okay, but my family's waiting for me to get back. Okay, I say to myself, we're going to do this. Men's room it is. In and out. I'll be quick. I straighten a wrinkle in my skirt. Here we go. Walking through the threshold, I am buffeted by a buffet of terrifying facts and distressing memories that rush to mind. Detailed accounts of assaults, videos of trans people being beaten and dragged out of bathrooms. Disneyland's a safe space, I remind myself. The most magical place on earth. I know I probably won't be attacked here, but hate speech, despising stares, or maybe even a light beating are all still on the menu as far as my amygdala is concerned. I try to hurry for a stall, but inside there's a line of men waiting. And urinals, oh, that just seems like asking for trouble. I take a spot in the line, occupying as little space as I possibly can and staring at my shoes like they are the most awe-inspiring sight on earth. And finally, mercifully, a stall opens. I hurry inside, and a few moments later, I'm on my way out. I made it. I am halfway to the door when I hear the words, "Faggot, can't you leave our children alone?" My heart cracks. I try to hold it inside. I return to my family, all smiles, and never mention this encounter. Not once before this moment that I'm sharing with you today. I had tried so hard to find a solution to this bathroom issue, like it was some sort of binary puzzle box. I just wanted to be safe and respectful of the people around me. And for heaven's sake, I just wanted to pee. But I couldn't do that without offending this stranger. Despite countless hours I've spent working and volunteering as a children's educator and entertainer, despite being there that day with my family and only wanting to cherish time with them, I somehow registered as a threat to this stranger and their kids. I was so casually labeled as a predator, a villain, a freak. I was right back in the worst of my adolescence, and I knew I did not belong. But there's some good news. We can change this reality. This doesn't need to be the future for today's queer youth. When I was a child, still catching frogs by the side of that pond, I believed I was part of the world, as natural, essential, and valuable as a leaf on a tree or a fish in the stream. In the course of my life, the forces of patriarchy did their absolute best to strip that belief away from me, to tell me I was abnormal, unnatural, unwanted, and without worth. And I'm still bombarded by these messages nearly any time I step outside or look at my phone. But at least for today, I can let those hateful slings ricochet off my self-love. Today, I understand that patriarchy is a social construct. It is not the all-encompassing reality it pretends to be. Who cares if this oppressive system has no place for me? Today, I know I am as much a part of this world as the flowers and the sun, as all of you listening, and as any other human to walk the earth. And all of us deserve a world where we can blossom and shine. I believe we can build that world together. But it starts with breaking down our barriers, our binaries, and our mistakes. Welcome back, and thanks for sticking with me. So, around this same time last summer, I invited Breaking Down Patriarchy listeners to send me their questions about my experiences and thoughts as a transgender person. And I received lots and lots of wonderful questions from you all. But flash forward to nearly a year later, and I still haven't offered you a response. I wish I could say I simply forgot, that I got busy, got distracted, and haven't had these questions lingering in the back of my heart, but that isn't the case. I haven't been too busy. I haven't been distracted. The truth is, I've been scared. As last year crept closer and closer to the presidential election, it became increasingly apparent that the Republican presidential candidate, along with many running on similar platforms for lesser offices, were turning their attention, their resources, and their malice towards trans people, towards my people, towards me. The political ads became increasingly bold-faced and vitriolic, and the culture followed. I couldn't open social media without seeing people loudly debating my every right. I began to hear dog whistles and slander in everyday conversation, even among my progressive community. During a time of wars and genocide, a time of grotesque wealth disparities, climate collapse, and school shootings, it's somehow been trans people's right to use the bathroom, to serve our country, to compete in games, or simply to exist that was being made a national priority. Against a backdrop of much more urgent needs, it's somehow our tiny minority group that was being centered in the political spotlight. And I got scared. I withdrew, and the situation only got worse. Trump won re-election. The rhetoric became more and more explicit, with more and more people no longer ashamed to hate us publicly. As we've already discussed, the legislation against trans people skyrocketed. The calls to queer suicide prevention hotlines spiked as well, and my heart shattered for all those who couldn't make that call. I had panic attacks. I started speaking quietly and fearfully to my partner and family in private moments about where we would flee to. Should we leave the country? Should I consider detransition? Try to pass in public? Should I buy a weapon? A gun? I stopped speaking at public events as I had been for years prior. I stopped going out altogether. I fell silent. And for this cowardice, I am truly and deeply sorry. I'm sorry to all of you who sent in questions and have been left too long waiting for answers, and I'm sorry to my queer community and to all of our nation's incredible queer and questioning youth for allowing myself to cower. But then, in these recent weeks, I began to follow some old advice I was raised on. It's advice that comes from a hero of mine, Mr. Rogers, or Mr. Rogers' mother, to be exact, since he once told us, quote, "When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" End quote. And so that's what I've been doing. I've looked to transgender leaders like Representative Zoe Zephyr, who's continuing to represent both her district and the trans community at large. I look to all the incredible, beautiful, and brave trans youth in my community who are continuing to speak out and write and protest while still staring down the worst of the news and their social media feeds. And, of particular note, I look to an ally we all know, Amy McPhie Allebest, who has never ever wavered in using her platform to speak out on behalf of her queer siblings and make sure that we know we're loved. And so, with these examples of courage, I'm finally here, ready to sit down in front of the camera and answer your questions. Thank you for your patience. As a small note before we dive in, I figure I should clarify my own gender identity. I am a transgender, non-binary person. Transgender because my gender does not align with the one I was assigned at birth and raised with, and non-binary because I find myself existing near the center of the gender spectrum, or, in my more daring moments, outside the spectrum altogether. Because of this, I use the pronouns they and them. I also identify as trans feminine. When I say this, I mean to say that I was assigned a place on the masculine end of the gender spectrum growing up, and I've since moved towards a more feminine identity. Therefore, I'm trans feminine. I became more feminine as I came into myself. Perhaps it's because of this that nearly every question I received relates to trans women. But I do think it worth pointing out for all of us that I received not a single question relevant to trans men or other trans masculine people. And I don't think that's a coincidence. While the crosshairs are on the trans community at large, the center of these sites are truly on trans women. Trans men are often relegated to an afterthought or totally forgotten as our culture continues to fixate on the denigration of women, regardless of their birth sex. Again, I don't think this is coincidental. Patriarchy at its most fundamental level depends upon the denigration of women and anyone who embodies feminine traits. This is why gay men have historically been a political and media obsession more so than gay women, and why trans women and other trans femmes in particular are victimized today. So, while I'm going to answer these questions, which focus on the trans feminine experience, my whole heart is also with my trans masculine family and with all these cis women for whom my people have become a convenient proxy. Now, let's finally get some of these questions answered, shall we? Our first question. I've long wondered, when someone moves to expressing/living as a woman, how do they define what is woman? If it's long hair, makeup, high heels, that's problematic, isn't it? How can we honor the lives of transgender people and de-emphasize the emphasis on gender and sex in so much of everyday life? Which I'd prefer to do. I think we'd all be better for it. Thank you for this question. To answer, I begin by asking you the same question back, though. How do you define what a woman is? Is it the anatomy that you were born into? And if so, would you cease to be a woman if your body changed? If, let's imagine for a moment, you were one of the countless women who have had to undergo a mastectomy, or like my mom, a hysterectomy, would you cease to be a woman? Of course you'd still be a woman, because it's who you are, because it's something essential to your identity, to your spirit. It runs deeper than what you were taught or what your body looks like or how you get dressed in the morning. So, no, it isn't high heels and long hair that make you a woman, just as it isn't my makeup or my hair that makes me who I am. Those things are just icing on the cake. They're elements of our gender presentation. Our gender identity, that's something we harbor deeper inside, and something each of us only knows for ourselves. If you woke up tomorrow in a different body and someone told you you were a man, would you believe them? I'm guessing no. And that same inner knowing is what transgender people all across the gender spectrum feel. We know who we are. We know our genders just as surely as we know our hearts and spirits, as surely as we know whether we prefer chocolate or vanilla, as sure as we know who we love and what that love feels like. This is how personal and deeply felt gender is. And perhaps you haven't had to recognize that same surety with your cisgenderness because nobody's asked. So again, I'll ask you, how do you know you're a woman? Now, as for how we can honor trans people and de-emphasize gender and sex in our culture, I have to tell you, question asker, respectfully, we disagree here. I don't believe a future with less emphasis on gender is the goal. Speaking for myself and for the trans people I checked in with in preparation for this video, none of us are dreaming of an agender future. Instead, we're dreaming of a future where a person's gender identity can be as simple as the binary or as personal as a fingerprint. And all of those identities are respected and celebrated. We dream of gender freedom and diversity and joy. But if you really, really want to know why so many trans femmes like me tend to wear heavy makeup and grow out our hair, I'll tell you it's not only a matter of leaping deep into the gender that we were long denied, it's also a matter of safety. Simply put, the more likely we are to appear as a binary gender in public, the safer we're going to be. So that makeup quite literally becomes our armor. Our sometimes exaggerated high femme gender presentation is a way of signaling, hey, I belong in this space. Of blending in, if only to shield us from harm. Believe me, on the rare days when I go out with no makeup in a dress, using any bathroom becomes a whole lot scarier. Glamming myself up helps keep me safe, and it's also kind of fun. Okay, I could probably keep talking about this for an hour, but we have lots of questions to cover, so let's keep moving. Question number 2, quote, I care about a 15-year-old who wants to transition male to female. They believe it will help their severe depression and anxiety. In the state of Tennessee, A 15-year-old does not have access to puberty blockers or other gender-affirming interventions. I believe they'll benefit from therapy and learning skills to cope with the anxiety and depression. Should this person seek medical interventions in an affirming state or continue working on the depression and anxiety? So first and foremost, my whole heart goes out to this young person. I can't even begin to fathom how difficult it must be to reckon with your gender identity as a teenager in America today. I only narrowly survived that journey myself during a comparatively far more tolerant time in the 90s and early 2000s. That said, I would actually hesitate to recommend medical intervention for anyone as a first step, or really ever as treatment for depression or anxiety. For some brief context here, I'm a person who's lived their entire life with a diagnosed anxiety disorder as well as chronic depression. And while I'm happier today than I've ever been, transition didn't cure me of those afflictions. I've had to seek help for managing them. They're lifelong mental health concerns on their own, and learning to live with them over the years has taken a lot of love and professional support. Transition has made my life incomparably better in countless ways, but it's not a panacea for these underlying conditions. So please, if you or someone you know is struggling with anxiety and especially with depression, seek help. Now, for this young person's journey with gender, which I sincerely hope has been coming along well since this question was first asked, I'd start by encouraging you not to panic. I promise there are plenty of options for gender-affirming care post-puberty, so there is no need to leap towards hormone blockers or other intervention until you're sure it's the right path for you. Instead, I'd encourage this person to first experiment with their presentation and with their inner sense of self. Maybe start trying out some new pronouns with trusted allies and with yourself in the mirror. Maybe try a new name if that feels right. Don't be afraid to try on genders. It can really be lots of fun and no one needs to know. You can also play with your presentation, with clothes and hair and makeup and even the way you move and hold yourself. Find what feels natural, what feels right for you. And then, when you're confident you know who you are and who you're becoming, have a conversation with your medical provider about gender-affirming care that's right for you. If necessary, consider relocation to a state or country where that care is more readily available. Honestly, I'd give this same recommendation to anyone listening who hasn't gone to question their gender before. Even if you're pretty sure that you're cis, try out some other options. Put on some makeup. Put on a fake mustache. Try some clothes you were never told to wear. Call yourself by a different name or pronoun. Modulate your voice. Find what feels good for you. No matter what, you're going to walk away more assured of who you are, or with a brand new facet of your identity to explore. There's nothing to lose. Okay, next question. When trans women claim that they're the same as women who grew up as a female, I understand why TERF women bristle at that. It's like appropriation. And as far as I understand, that's why the trans community is mad at J.K. Rowling. My question here, after this lead up, is why the trans community insists on trans women being called real women and not trans women. Okay. I have never in my life encountered a transgender woman insisting on being called a real woman instead of being called a trans woman. I truly don't know where that allegation's coming from. What I do see is people of all genders insisting that trans women are women. And stop. We can be both trans and real. So I wonder, do you actually have a trans woman in your life claiming to know everything about the cisgender experience? I've personally never met a person like that. And all the trans femmes I know, myself included, would never make such a claim. Those assigned female at birth have their struggles, and those transitioning face a totally different set of hardships unique to our lives. All of us struggle against patriarchal structures that repress us, each in our own way, and my only wish is that we should be allies in that struggle, each from our unique backgrounds, all of us equally valid, or, as you put it, real. This isn't a matter of us being exactly the same. And again, I know no trans people claiming such a perfect parallel. Rather, this is a matter of all of us recognizing each other's unique identities and circumstances, but coming together with acceptance, with validation, and in that shared fight for our equal rights in our culture and under the law. If you do know trans femmes and trans women claiming otherwise, then perhaps this is a personal conversation for you to have with them directly. But otherwise, I assure you, we can all be a bit different, and there's no deficit of realness to go around. Now, as far as she who must not be named, I can only tell you how utterly heartbreaking her vitriol against the trans community has been for me. I grew up a total Potterhead. I was in line for every book release and have cherished memories of staying up all night with my sister to see who could finish the book first. Now, at the start of Pride Month 2025, these memories have turned bitter and painful as the authors announce that the money she made off her franchise will be funding a new organization advocating against the rights of transgender people. It's been utterly devastating, and I regret that I'll never be able to return to that once loved wizarding world the same way. The question I keep asking myself is simply, what has our community ever done to her? And there's no answer I can fathom that would ever make this make sense. Next question. This is a short one from a contributor who asked, quote, "Are non-binary people sometimes trans and sometimes cis?" End quote. Short answer, yes. We are sometimes trans and sometimes cis. Though, I will say that the number of non-binary cisgender people is considerably lower than that of those who transitioned. Let's break it down. Sometimes a child is born with anatomy that defies the binary and are raised as intersex and or non-binary. This could be someone who identifies as cisgender and non-binary. Basically, their gender never changed. Sometimes parents also choose to raise their children without an assigned gender, and sometimes those children grow to embrace that non-binary lifestyle. They too could be considered cisgender and NB. In short, if someone was raised non-binary and remained non-binary, they might consider themselves cisgender because no transition occurred. On the other hand, most non-binary people, like me, were raised with a binary gender and later had to discover our identities on our own, transitioning to it at a later date, thus making us trans non-binary. At the end of the day, though, I'd encourage you not to get too caught up in these micro-labels. Just get to know the people around you with an open heart. Show them they're safe, believe what they say, and I promise you they will show you who they are. On to the next question. What topics of conversation are appropriate to get to know a trans person? Or is it better to avoid talking about their gender experience until they bring it up? I love this question because it tells me this contributor is looking for a respectful way to get closer to trans people in their life. Yay. As for my answer, I encourage you to really just assess the individual relationship. Should you bring up a person being trans on first meeting them? No, probably not. You probably also shouldn't ask them about their childhood trauma or their favorite sexual position. These are just odd and invasive topics to bring up with a stranger. So get to know them just like anyone else. Unless the topic of the conversation is particularly relevant to trans issues, I'd say follow their lead. If they bring it up, great, talk about it. If they don't, they probably have other things on their mind. I assure you, even as a very openly transgender person, I rarely want to chat about my gender identity. I'm sure this podcast makes it seem otherwise, but really it does not come up much in my day-to-day life. There are just a lot of other more interesting things to talk about. Our next question is a tough one. This submitter asked, I have a friend who's a transgender woman. When I learned that she had her jaw broken in 6 different places by men because she used a public bathroom, I was horrified. I'd like to know, Sam, what you have to do day to day to stay safe. Or maybe this hasn't been an issue for you. Also, what support did you receive and are you receiving in your journey? What's helpful and what's not helpful? Question asker, I am so sorry that your friend went through that. She did not have to suffer that injustice, and our world should be better by now. It really, really should be. I wish I could say that the fear of those sorts of violence haven't been an issue for me, but it's an issue for all queer and transgender people. Safety concerns need to be taken seriously. In terms of my own precautions, I'll say that first and foremost, I live in one of our country's most trans-friendly cities, and that is purposeful. As a closeted teen in a heteronormative environment, I stayed closeted until I could relocate someplace safer. Not all trans people have that option, but I am grateful that I did. Even in my liberal queer bastion of Portland, Oregon, though, violent transphobic incidents still occur. And of course, as I've mentioned earlier, sometimes I travel, so safety precautions need to be present. For starters, I don't leave the house without some form of self-defense in my pocket. For years, this was a self-defense keychain, and when I didn't have that, I gripped my keys between my knuckles when I was nervous, or I at least try to have a whistle in my pocket. These days, I tend to prefer keeping pepper spray on hand. I've practiced using it many times just to make sure I can properly dispense it if necessary, but fortunately, I have no real-world applications yet. In addition, I try to always be mindful of my environment. Not necessarily cowering when I catch a nasty glare, but keeping track of where that person is in the room. I don't walk unfamiliar neighborhoods after dark. I always have a charged cell phone or other means of contacting help. And importantly, when it comes to gendered restrooms, I have to confess, I'll usually sooner hold my pee and risk infection than use a gendered restroom in an unfamiliar establishment. Ideally, though, I try to always have a trusted ally with me when I'm visiting a new location, and I'll ask them to accompany me to the ladies' room. Or, if that ally is male, ask them to wait by the door and be vigilant, just in case. I'd also encourage any trans person concerned about safety to seek transgender community in your area and talk with them about trusted locations and those where you should maybe practice a little more caution. It's a good way to get to know locals and to assess local risks and safe havens. Plus, you might walk away with some new friends. In terms of the support I've received, there's more than I could list in a short time. But in terms of safety, the best support is having friends who will walk me to my car or front door, or again, who will join me or monitor the bathroom for me. And I've fortunately been blessed with a few men in my life who embody exactly the kind of protective, positive masculinity I wish all men would aspire to, eagerly stepping between me and escalating strangers, speaking out when they hear transphobic remarks, or just insisting on making sure I get home safe. I'm forever grateful to have those men in my life. Again, to summarize, know your surroundings, carry self-defense, and whenever possible, travel with a trusted friend. I wish I could pretend the threats to our safety aren't real, but they are, and all trans folks need to take them seriously. Even then, it won't always be enough. But I encourage all queer people to do what they can to minimize the risks. Okay, let's keep moving along with another question. In what way is gender a social construct versus a biological experience? If I'm born female and feel like I'm male, what does that specifically mean? In what ways do you view yourself differently from your assigned gender versus how society sees and treats a male or female? Do culture and supposed norms play a role at all? For this question, I'll refer you first to another Breaking Down Patriarchy resource, Amy's phenomenal YouTube video on breaking down sex, gender, and orientation. I think that's going to answer a lot of these questions. As for my own experience, though, I see myself as myself, not only outside the bounds of gender norms, which never ever fit right, but I'm also able to recognize myself now more wholly, to self-actualize, and after many years of feeling like a fake, like a performer or an imposter, I truly now feel at home in my body and in my spirit. This is how I view myself, as me, finally liberated from the assigned performance of a gender that never felt right at all. If you want specifics about what was normative and assigned versus who I really am, I'll tell you that I was offered many fairly permissive definitions of masculinity as an AMAB person growing up. I was raised in a liberal and, for the time, fairly accepting home. Masculinity, I was told, could be gentle, could be nurturing, could be emotional. But I still didn't feel at home in that identity. I could look around at all the wonderful men in my life and all these great role models I was offered, but something in my heart still knew I wasn't one of them. So, yes, many trans people feel a need to rebel against gender norms, and I'm not exempt from that. But I can tell you that even in a fairly permissive and expansive definition of the gender binary, I still wasn't at home there. And when I first learned about non-binary people, it was a moment of utter revelation and ecstasy, like an immediate recognition and an excitement about my future I'd never felt before. So I can't tell you exactly what your own feelings of being a different gender might mean, but I can tell you they're worth exploring if they're there. And I wish you so much love and grace if that's a path you're exploring. Good luck. Our next question is a two-parter. The submitter asks, what is your favorite part of being trans and non-binary? What's something that the people who love you do or could do that really helps you feel relational safety? Okay, I have to say, I appreciate all of our question askers, but this is definitely my favorite question. Thank you so much for this generous inquiry. And actually, the answer to these two questions is the same. There is so much I adore about being trans and non-binary. And I'd be remiss not to mention things like knowing myself and inner peace and self-confidence. But if you really want to know my favorite thing about being trans, it's hand-me-down clothes. One of my greatest sources of joy today, especially in the years immediately following my coming out, has been women in my life gifting me their old jewelry and clothes. It's a form of community building and play that I hadn't had access to since getting to play dress up as a little kid. And it's such a font of delight. There is a thrill that comes with putting on a dress and liking the way I look and knowing I look good. But then there's a special added warmth and strength that comes from knowing that that outfit was my friend's. And I get to wear it because they love me and want me to be who I am. It's such a heartfelt thrill every single time, and it never goes away, or at least it hasn't so far. And I get it every time I slip on that necklace or skirt or whatever it is and think of my friend who loves me and get to feel embraced by that love all day long. So yeah, the best part for me is definitely the hand-me-downs, like a special secret inheritance I never knew I was going to receive, or like wearing a hug from a friend all day. It's a treat. And I really can't wait for the day I get to pass along some of my clothes to the next trans girl in my life. I hope that she'll love it as much as I have. As for the second part, what people can do to make me feel relationally safe, again, hand-me-downs rule. But outside of that, for starters, you've got to get the pronouns right. You don't have to be perfect every time, and I especially hold grace for family and other folks who've known me long before transition, but practice. Practice, practice, practice. And when you make a mistake, correct yourself quickly and move along. Using those proper pronouns tells me that you see me for who I am and that you care. Beyond this, it also makes a huge difference to have the people who love me feel comfortable hanging out with me in public and openly acknowledging our friendship. Which is to say, introduce me to people. Don't be shy, and please don't be embarrassed. Take me to your work event. Let me be your +1 to the wedding. I don't want you to bat an eye when you sit down next to me or take me out on the dance floor even. Make it normal to be seen with me in public. It helps me find the confidence to be myself in new situations and is always appreciated. Should this be baseline? Yeah, probably. But I know what our current culture is like, and I'm grateful for all the friends I have who refuse to back down in the face of it, who are proud to have me around. And Lastly, if you're not in a position to do any of the above, maybe like a newer acquaintance to a trans person, just give them a compliment. It's an immediate signal that you see them and approve. So start with something specific and non-threatening. I like your shoes. What a pretty necklace. Your hair looks good today. I know for myself, if I hear that, I immediately categorize that person as an ally, and I might just turn to them if I'm needing support. Up next, we actually have a couple more questions from the same submitter who went on to ask, when and how did you know you were trans and non-binary? Any advice for the trans youngsters? For the first question, how and when did I know? I hope I already covered that in part 1 of this episode. But for part 2 of the question, what advice I have for trans youngsters? Honestly, having spent a fair bit of time with trans youth in just these past few months, actually, I don't think they need my advice. There is so much confidence and courage in today's trans youth that I could never have fathomed at that age, so I'd follow their lead. But for those really looking towards an older trans person for guidance, I'd just tell you to remember that you're a part of this world and you belong. This whole hateful transphobic culture we find ourselves in, it isn't intrinsic to our world. It's a very purposeful, patriarchal construct that a handful of people have built right here, right now, to advance their own goals, and it will pass. Don't mistake the real world our culture will try to sell you on for what the world actually is. Because our planet is beautiful and wildly diverse, and you are absolutely as much a part of it as every plant and animal and person. We have always been here and always will be, no matter what a few temperamental billionaires and politicians try to tell you. Don't fall for their lies. Look to the natural world instead. See how weird and wild and wonderful it is. You're a part of that. Trust yourself. No one knows you better than you do. And if you haven't found a community that embraces you yet, keep looking. I promise we're out here, and we can't wait to welcome you with the widest arms. Most of all, if any trans or questioning youth is listening, know that we need you in this world. I need you in this world. So please, no matter what is happening, hang in there and reach out a hand if you need some support. You'll be surprised how many people are waiting on the other side to help. Our next question submitter asks, I had this thought today while listening to a podcast on weight loss drugs and how transformative they are for people who feel they don't fit their bodies. I thought, wow, why can't this same analogy be used to help transphobic people understand how this is so very similar to what's happening inside of trans bodies too? I'm not sure if this argument counterpoint has been used before, but it occurred to me that it is inarguable. Why should weight be different than gender? And why should some people get to match their internal self-image with the external, but others cannot? Of course, I'm sure religion will be used to argue it, but anyway, I just want to know your thoughts on this. Thanks, question asker. I'm going to keep this brief because, truthfully, I don't find weight and gender to be particularly helpful analogies for each other. I think a more practical analogy for transgender affirming care is cisgender affirming care. Cisgender people routinely access resources to affirm their gender, including everything from breast augmentation and hair plugs to hormone therapy and erection pills. I'd much sooner compare why straight people have unrestricted access to what makes them feel good in their gender to why trans people have those same rights restricted and policed. So, I am sorry to pivot off your original analogy, but I hope this will be a useful point of comparison for you. Now, our next question comes to us from someone very special who asks, trans athletes in sports. My Gen Z children don't allow any room for discussion. Athletes should be able to compete in the category that they identify with. But I have friends who are equally adamant that athletes must compete in the category of the sex they were assigned at birth. Typically, these tend to be parents of girls who are concerned that trans girls have biological advantages. I want every human to have a safe, healthy space to flourish and achieve their potential. Cisgender girls need that, and trans athletes need that. Gender and sometimes sex are not binary. What are your thoughts? Well, here's where I'm going to lose some of you, but let's get into it anyway. There have been at least 3 transgender athletes in the past year who have been glaringly forced into the spotlight. I wonder if you remember their names. Do you remember what tournaments they did or didn't win? Does it keep you up at night? I ask this because I doubt it bothers you still, but I can guarantee you that each of these athletes' lives were irrevocably damaged by our scrutiny and sensationalism. And here's where I'll get really spicy. I'll remind you all listening that these are just games. That's it. They're just games that we're playing. The only lives on the line are those of these brave trans athletes, so please think twice before you drag them through the mud for the sanctity of a sporting match. I mean, do we really care as deeply about the sanctity of sports when it comes to doping, to bribery, to domestic abuse, any of the countless other issues that are plaguing our athletic culture? Why don't we react with the same horror to a male athlete beating women as we do to a trans woman just competing? In my opinion, this has never been about fairness, just as it was never a matter of fairness or sportsmanship to prevent athletes of color from competing or to prevent cis women from competing. It's just the latest version of scapegoating run amok, and sports is an easy place for the media to get your goat. So, I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, my response to the question of trans athletes is simply, get over it. There's no data to actually suggest they have any sort of unfair advantage, while there are countless actual exploits being abused by their cis counterparts. And at the end of the day, it's a game. If you can't play nice, don't play at all. Now, for those genuinely concerned about girls and women being able to compete in sports, this was a long fought for and still fought for right. And yes, we need to be able to talk about it. For me, that conversation starts by establishing why we play these games and why we lay significance on them. If it's for the sake of play, team building, fitness, being our best, then it shouldn't matter who's on the team. And if you're wanting to make sure girls and women are able to earn scholarships and have viable careers in sports, still I'd tell you, I don't think trans women are the enemy. The bulk of the data we have at the moment suggests no statistical advantage for trans women, since the vast majority of trans athletes are already on HRT by the time they compete, meaning their hormone levels are within the traditionally female range. But sure, we actually don't have a lot of data on this yet, so let's keep track of that. And if we do find down the line that trans women have a proven advantage, then yes, we should sit down and reassess. But for now, we don't have enough information to back those claims, and instead we do have heaps of evidence that trans exclusionary policies affect women of all backgrounds by introducing invasive gender testing and making it generally harder and harder for girls to compete. So I'd encourage us to stick together on this one. I promise no one is transitioning just to steal your spot on the team. Okay, are you still with me? Great. Let's move on to our next spicy question here, which asks, I think we've talked a bit about the issue of trans chess players and the can of worms it has opened to ask whether trans women have a biological or social advantage over cis women. Thoughts? We all know there is no biological advantage for a person of any gender playing chess. That idea is just blatantly rooted in sexism and archaic ideas of women having inferior minds. No matter what genitals or hormone levels you came into this world with, I assure you they won't make you better or worse at chess. Only your intellect and practice are going to do that. As far as social advantages, those claims have some more grounding. If you were raised a boy, you probably received encouragement as an analytical thinker. And I'll be a little more personal here. I'm a trans femme who grew up as a boy going to chess camp. I adored chess. I studied and competed regularly until I hit puberty. As I came into my sense of self and gender, I became fearful of participating in public events like chess tournaments. So I quit. It's a regret that's followed me the rest of my life. And had I not had that fear of judgment, I probably would have continued playing chess competitively. So there are pros and cons to the social element of being transgender as a chess player. It can cut one of 1,000 ways depending on each individual's experience. At the end of the day, though, I think most of us, if not all of us, would agree that we want people to be able to compete to the best of their ability, regardless of social upbringing. And I think a much more productive use of our time would be focusing on uplifting girls and breaking down social barriers to chess, rather than penalizing this tiny minority of the population. All right, we're nearing the end here, but there's still a few questions left, and this next one was really fascinating for me. The question asker asks, I want to be very gentle and careful about this question. One tricky thing about watching a certain loved one's transition has been the adoption of certain features of femininity that I don't see as being positive. As a trans woman, this person is suddenly saying things like, I can't lift that, it's too heavy. She talks constantly about clothes and hair and makeup, to the exclusion of interests that she had before her transition, like politics, sports, and philosophy. These things can be triggering for me, because I grew up in a family where my mom sometimes tells my nephews, who are children, to lift things for me because I'm a woman. And I get so frustrated with women friends and my own mom for eschewing important topics and occupying their time with ornamentation. So it's kind of painful for me to watch this person's expression of womanhood take forms that, to me, seem like negative stereotypes. I wonder if part of this is a phase as she's figuring out how she wants to express femininity, since she didn't get a chance to figure that out in childhood and puberty like I did. I want to be compassionate, see from her point of view, and give her the benefit of the doubt. Okay. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that I'm nowhere near close enough to this clearly very personal relationship to understand all its nuance. Here's what I will tell you, though. In all likelihood, your trans loved one, she hasn't had the ability to talk about her hair, her makeup, or really to do anything except present and perform masculinity her whole life. The permission to engage with femininity is probably new, a permission she had to grant herself, and the space between her true self, her inner womanhood, and then those social expectations and stereotypes that she also steeped in, that's probably a brand new labyrinth for her to find herself in. I'm sure you remember how hard it was for you. How often you were told to talk about hair and makeup instead of sports or politics. Now envision the inverse. How exciting must hair and makeup suddenly seem? Again, this is a particularly tangled web, since it sounds like you've been bucking against, and over the years I imagine freeing yourself from, a lot of these stereotypical trappings of femininity, while your trans loved one likely never got the chance to play in those waters. To you, these things feel maybe tepid, restrictive, or even oppressive. But for her, it's this new ocean of self to explore. Perhaps she'll find her home in those waters and never return again to her former discussion of philosophy and politics. And if that's the case, I hope that you'll be able to support her in that space. But more than likely, I think you're probably right. This is probably an exploratory phase for her. And in time, she'll find herself delving deeper into the complexities of her gender and discovering a more complete sense of self there. My best suggestions for now are to encourage her expressions of the high femme and stereotypical femininity that she's enjoying. Because at the end of the day, will you love her any less if that is where she stays? If not, you've got nothing to fear. And if so, then it's probably worth further unpacking your own relationship to these traditionally feminine interests. Why is it so bothersome? Embrace each other, give each other the benefits of the doubt, and when everything shakes out someday, I hope you'll love each other all the same. And lastly, I'll just say that if you're particularly close and this pattern of behavior has continued, say, for the year since you asked this question, then it's probably okay to mention your feelings about these feminine and arguably patriarchal social expectations she's been dabbling in. If it's really distressing for you and this is a loving relationship, I'm sure she'd want to know. Wishing you both lots of productive thoughts and conversations ahead. All right, we're nearly at the end here, but I'd like to answer just a few more excellent questions that were sent in. This next one asking, how do you feel, RE, coming out to people upon meeting? Do you assume they know your pronouns? Okay, thank you for this question asker. So I have very little hesitation coming out to people upon meeting them. I'm a visibly trans person, and I love that about myself. Meanwhile, a person I meet is likely to have one of two common responses, acceptance or rejection. Either way, I get to know where I stand right away and can move on. As a non-binary person, I also have some advantage here, though. I am very seldom, if ever, hoping to pass for either binary gender, since my default gender is considered queer, which is to say, for non-binary folks, we're automatically outside the normative expectations of gender presentation. No one expects a non-binary person to dress or talk or behave in any particular way. A trans man or trans woman might not have those same liberties. They're more likely to be placed under scrutiny and have to navigate all the confusion of gender norms like we discussed in our previous question. Now, as for whether or not I assume someone knows my pronouns, no, I definitely try not to assume this. That said, as they/them pronouns are increasingly becoming our accepted neutral standard to use for people before learning their actual pronouns, people do often assume correctly with me. Again, it's a nifty perk of being non-binary. That said, though, I make a habit of introducing myself with pronouns probably 9 out of 10 times. It just sets a good precedent and takes away some of the awkward guesswork. Safe to say, if I don't tell someone my pronouns, it means I'm not planning on talking with them for very long. Okay, everyone, we made it to the last question. I am so grateful for this final question because it's the perfect way to discuss some action items here at the end of our episode. Our final submitter asked, what are some easy gender-affirming things we can incorporate into our daily lives? So, since this was submitted as a question about the transgender experience, I'm going to answer first with some gender-affirming things you can do daily for the trans people in your life. Use correct pronouns and practice. Speak up against transphobia if you see it. Read and watch and listen to trans creators who will keep expanding your gender imagination. Make trans-affirming statements. Advocate for LGBTQIA+ rights. And support the queer community around you. If you're doing any mix of these things regularly, I promise you the trans people in your life are going to take notice. But here's the more interesting question for me, though, and it's a question I have for each of you listening. What are some ways that you affirm your own gender? Well, I would encourage you, as I already have, to question your gender. Because, again, even if it's what you expect, you'll probably find yourself more affirmed in that identity and more comfortable discussing gender with others. Again, there's nothing I want more than for everyone in our world to feel safe and confident and affirmed in their gender, and for all of us to have the freedom and courage to be ourselves. Because I truly believe when we live as our authentic selves, all of us prosper. So explore your own gender, find the things that affirm it, and do these affirming things for others too. And that brings us to the end of our episode. Before I go, though, I want to say one last thing. Even if you listened all this way and you still feel like you just don't get it, maybe you don't know any trans people, or maybe we make you uncomfortable. Maybe you were raised believing different things and you're not sure those things will change. Maybe you just didn't like my answers to these questions. For those of you among us, I just want you to know this. Being able to live as my authentic self, to be openly transgender, has saved my life, yes, but it's also made me a better person. Not being trapped in that self-destructive cycle of trying to hide who I am means I'm instead able to show up more for the people I love. It's made me a better friend, a better family member, and a better partner. I'm able to contribute more to my community. And my ability to do all this takes nothing away from you or anyone else. Transgender people only want to be our best, truest selves, and allowing us to do so benefits everyone. At the end of the day, we're only asking for the same virtues that every other American holds dear, for our freedom, liberty, and the right to pursue our own happiness. Thank you all for listening, and happy Pride!